Good evening and welcome to our RFL President's Day special. I'm Andrew Whitman, in tonight for Richard French. For the next hour, we're going to look at the man who is in the White House now and compare him to past presidents as well as their policies. We're also going to look at our first president and the time he spent in New York City before the U.S. was even a country, back when he was still a general. But we are going to begin tonight with this man, the 45th president of the United States. Donald Trump's second year in office is just kicking off. His first year, memorable for a lot of things, many of them not very good. His first big move in office was a travel ban against people from a slew of Muslim-majority countries. Trouble is that policy was rolled out without coordinating with other agencies, and federal courts wound up overturning it. It spurred confusion and protests, and the legal battle is ongoing. Later in January, he nominated Neil Gorsuch for the Supreme Court. Gorsuch, of course, was confirmed and now sits as an associate justice on the court. The first firing came in mid-February when National Security Advisor Michael Flynn was canned over the Russia scandal. We're going to talk more about that in just a little bit. Trump's first year marked by a record amount of turnover, 34%. Trump's turnover rate for year one, double that of the closest modern administration, that of Ronald Reagan. And according to the Brookings Institution, it far outpaces any other recent presidency. In April, the president ordered airstrikes against Syria in response to the Assad regime using chemical weapons against his own people. In May, he fired FBI Director James Comey, and that led to the appointment of Robert Mueller as special counsel in the Russia matter soon after. In June, President Trump announced in the Rose Garden that he was pulling the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accords. America now the only country on earth that is not part of it. Even Syria recently signed on. Moving along in Trump's first year, August, white nationalists marched in Charlottesville, Virginia, protesting the removal of a Robert E. Lee statue. Counter-protesters were also there, and one person was killed. In the wake of that, President Trump gave a rambling press conference and defended the neo-Nazis and KKK groups by putting them on equal footing as the people who were protesting them. Here's a sample.
You had some very bad people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
Soon after that, Trump's attempts to have Obamacare repealed failed in the U.S. Senate when John McCain made a dramatic return and cast the deciding no vote. The Arizona senator is continuing to battle brain cancer. Then Hurricane Maria slammed into Puerto Rico. Trump was criticized for speaking highly of Texas and Florida after their hurricanes, but slamming Puerto Rico. He criticized the island, feuded with its leaders, and when he visited, he tossed paper towels at people who had lost everything. And in December, President Trump endorsed Roy Moore for the Alabama Senate race. Judge Moore was an accused child molester who was booted from the Alabama High Court 2 separate times. He lost to Doug Jones in a deep red state that now has a Democratic senator. And fast forward to December, Republicans rammed through a tax reform bill in a straight party line vote that prevented him from ending his first year without any major policy achievements. So let's discuss the president's first year and compare it to presidents of the past. And we're joined tonight by our special President's Day panel. David Woolner is an author and senior fellow and resident historian of the Roosevelt Institute. He is also the author of The Last 100 Days, FDR at War and at Peace. We're also joined tonight by Dwayne Tenenbaum. He's a history professor at Lehman College. He is also an author of Herbert H. Lehman, A Political Biography. Gentlemen, welcome. Happy President's Day. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Pleasure. Let's start with President Trump's first year. And Dwayne, how would you compare it to presidents in the past, particularly the stumbles that it appeared this president had? Can you recall a president in relatively recent history who had a similarly rocky first year?
Not really. I mean, I think Trump is unique in the sense of it being a very rough start. On the other hand, we need to look at more than just legislation. I mean, his legislative accomplishments have been limited, mainly the tax cut. But in terms of the people he's appointed to cabinet positions, to head up the EPA, to head up the Department of Education, the rules and regulations and executive orders that have done away with policies that Obama had instituted, the appointment to the Supreme Court, Trump has had much more influence on national policy than one would realize if one looked only at legislation.
And I think most people tend not to see that impact, the impact of those appointments or the internal changes in policy and policy directions because of the stumbles, the scandals, the investigations.
Exactly. I mean, you look at things like the Consumer Finance Protection Agency. Trump installed the budget director as the head of the Consumer Protection Agency. and he's basically zeroed out their budget. So they're no longer going to investigate Equifax or payday loans or some of the major problems. The Department of Education is no longer investigating for-profit universities such as Trump University. So I think that there's a lot that has been accomplished of the traditional Republican agenda by means other than legislation. And you mentioned this Gorsuch appointment to the Supreme Court. Trump has also gotten through a significant number of appointees to the lower courts, the district courts and the appellate level courts as well.
I'm curious for your take too, both the stumbles but also the impact that he has had in terms of his appointments and policy shifts.
Well, I would agree with Dwayne, and I think in some ways, some of these, when it comes to things like the court and the environment, Trump's legacy may be more long-lasting in terms of its impact. One could argue, of course, in a very damaging way, for example, when it comes to issues like the environment. We've certainly had presidents who stumbled before. You know, I can think Jimmy Carter's very rough opening, Bill Clinton's. You know, we've had a tendency in the last few decades to often elect people who don't really have a lot of experience in national office, like Carter and Clinton, and they do have rough first years. There is a kind of learning curve that goes, but I think Trump is, in many respects, unprecedented in the kind of inexperience and lack of temperament that we just haven't seen in any other administration.
And I wanted to explore that a little bit because while other presidents have not had executive experience or federal level experience, President Trump is unique in that he has had no political experience before winning the presidency. There are others who have come from military backgrounds, but I'm curious your thoughts of how this may have helped or hurt the president in his first year, and is there any sort of comparison in terms of being an outsider coming into that job?
Well, I mean, you know, for example, many presidents come in with a kind of an agenda. The two that come to mind in past decades, most recent decades since the Second World War, would be LBJ and President Reagan, you know, who had a clear agenda, who used their mandate with the electorate and with Congress to put forward a kind of vision for the future. With Trump, you have a man who is really obsessed with himself and not really thinking in broader terms. I don't think we've ever had a leader in the White House that we can compare this to. And I think when we're talking about the confusion in the White House, when we're talking about the temperament, I think that when you combine all of that with the lack of experience, you get things like a 34% turnover in the White House, which is unprecedented. The other thing that I think we need to remember is that prior to President Trump, there was a kind of degree of respect for the office. You know, we tend to forget that the President of the United States has two jobs. He's head of government, which means he's got to get into the rough and tumble of politics and try to get legislation and his agenda through. But he or she is also the head of state, representing the country as a whole. And President Trump has been quite happy to, you know, essentially push aside large segments of the population and engage in behavior that millions of Americans find offensive. So that's never happened before in quite the same way, that brazen willingness to take on these issues.
An interesting comparison in some ways is with Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower came from a military background as commander-in-chief of NATO and before that Allied forces during World War II. And the thing that was most difficult for Eisenhower to adjust to as president was that when he gave an order, nothing happened, or nothing necessarily happened. It took him a while to get used to the ways of the federal government. Certainly Trump, coming from being the head of the Trump organization, I mean, we laugh, his signature line on TV was, "You're fired." But that's the way he ran his organization, and now he's in a situation where that's no longer necessarily the case. You also have the problem, I think, that's more relevant to Republican presidents, in that many supporters in the Republican Party want to roll back the role of government, don't really believe in an active federal government. So how do you get somebody to serve in an administration if their role is really going to be cutting back or eliminating various programs? why would you serve in the federal government if you don't really believe in the federal government being relevant, being important in people's lives?
And I think that's a very important point, and I think we also shouldn't forget that part of the problem is not just Trump. It is Trump and Congress. It is the entire political spectrum in Washington today, which is by and large dysfunctional. So in a way, he's a kind of manifestation of that dysfunctionality.
And we're going to talk more about the checks and balances or lack thereof a little bit later in the broadcast, but we could not avoid discussing some of President Trump's scandals as when we discussed his first year, and certainly the Russia investigation has hung over the Trump administration since literally day one. Now, we want to compare it to prior scandals. Of course, we had Watergate, which led President Nixon to become the only president ever to resign.
Some people, quite properly appalled at the abuses that occurred, will say that Watergate demonstrates the bankruptcy of the American political system. I believe precisely the opposite is true. Watergate represented a series of illegal acts and bad judgments by a number of individuals. It was the system that has brought the facts to light and that will bring those guilty to justice.
14 years later, we had the Iran-Contra scandal.
Take full responsibility for my own actions and for those of my administration. As angry as I may be about activities undertaken without my knowledge, I am still accountable for those activities.
Fast forward 11 years later to 1998, and who could forget this?
I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never. These allegations are false.
And then from 1998, we flash forward to 2017.
The entire thing has been a witch hunt, and there is no collusion between certainly myself and my campaign, but I can always speak for myself and the Russians, zero. I think it divides the country.
Trying to compare the Trump scandals to scandals of the past, I mean, the most obvious is that the Russia situation has been dogging this president literally from day one. That's not the only difference, though. It's differences in how the White Houses have handled these situations.
I think what's really important to put it into perspective here is, again, it's this lack of respect for the office and lack of respect for critical institutions.
How has that manifested itself?
Well, for example, his dismissal of the press, that, you know, the press is the enemy, public enemy. Even Richard Nixon here in the Watergate scandal alluding to the fact that the system worked. In other words, the justice system was doing its job. The law enforcement agencies were doing their job. Here we have an administration that's aggressively trying to undermine the very institutions that have those responsibilities to maintain the rule of law in the country. So, or the institution of the press. So I think it's quite a step backwards. In fact, it's almost a free fall backwards from this idea that no person in the United States is above the law, and the president, above all else, should be the one to, you know, uphold that standard.
Between past presidents, would they sort of put almost a firewall between themselves and the investigators who are going to let them do their job? It does seem like Trump is trying to play the referees, if you will.
Right, but other presidents have done the same. Who did John F. Kennedy appoint as his Attorney General?
His brother.
His brother, Robert Kennedy. If we go back to Nixon and Watergate, Nixon appointed L. Patrick Gray to head the FBI. He used the CIA to try to head off an FBI investigation into the whole Watergate mess. So there are a lot of similarities. And the other thing we need to remember about Watergate and certainly around Contra, Congress was controlled by the opposition political party, which wanted to get to the bottom of those scandals. Congress today is, both the House and the Senate are under Republican majorities. And for the most part, Republicans in Congress have shown no inclination to really investigate any collusion or any malfeasance on behalf of the Trump administration.
And David, as I think back to the Clinton White House dealing with Lewinsky and the Reagan White House dealing with Iran-Contra, it seemed like that really shackled their ability to make policy and govern to a certain degree. That has not been a problem for the Trump administration. Not nearly to the same extent.
Well, part of it is, I think, that Trump himself thrives on chaos. I mean, he has been brilliant at keeping the public's attention off everything but what really matters. I mean, you know, part of what I think he tries to do is to keep us distracted by sending out tweets and other outrageous statements, because he knows that that will create all kinds of public commentary and attention. But, you know, I think the thing, I agree with Dwayne, but I also think that there were, you know, on both sides of the aisle, you had Republicans and Democrats that put the institutions of government, the rule of law, ahead of everything else. And what worries me about today's situation is the lack or the fact that that ability to stand up for the rule of law and for these institutions seems to be waning. And I think, you know, given that they're under assault from the White House, more members of Congress should stand up.
Yeah, you've got a Jeff Flake from Arizona who has spoken out against Trump and his conduct, but has yet to vote against the Trump policies, whether it was the tax cut or any other meaningful measures.
Finally, I want to hit on the media to a certain degree. You mentioned Trump's Twitter feed, which obviously is unique. Only Trump and Obama have even had access to that medium. But so many people who I've talked to about Trump look at Fox News, Breitbart, and conservative media and think, well, they have a state media almost, in a sense, running interference for them. But that's not entirely unique in American history. We certainly have had jaded and partisan media supporting and attacking presidents in the past.
Yeah, you go back to the election of 1800 between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, the Alien and Sedition Act. The Sedition Act was passed in 1798, and the Adams administration used it to shut down Republican newspapers. Well, they were called the Republicans the Jeffersonian newspapers of that era that were criticizing President Adams and his administration. So there's a long, actually our history is much more one of partisan newspapers. You know, papers like the St. Louis Globe Democrat. I mean, they didn't used to hide their affiliations. So that's been more the reality, and the present, more objective press, at least the printed press. But the media has grown so large that people pick and choose. And that's part of what made it possible for the Russians who've just been indicted by Special Prosecutor Mueller today to use Facebook and to use the various new media to try to spread confusion, you know, within the American system.
All right, we'll take our first break. When we come back, the rise of Donald Trump has spurred a rise in nationalism. We've seen this before. The question is, how does this